I knew the HOA in this neighborhood was bad, but I never expected them to sink to this level. I stood frozen on my front lawn, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. My sister's wheelchair ramp gone, bulldozed, nothing but splinters and dust left where it once stood. Ava was going to lose her mind. She was the governor of this state, a powerhouse in politics, and somehow these power-hungry HOA board members thought they could push her around like any other resident. They had no idea who they were messing with. I turned and saw Linda Brewster standing at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed in the way only an entitled HOA president could manage. She was the type of woman who thrived on control, who thought her clipboard gave her absolute authority over everyone's lives. That ramp was a violation, Linda said, her voice laced with fake politeness. It didn't meet HOA aesthetic standards. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Are you out of your mind? That ramp was ADA compliant. My sister needs it to get inside my house. Linda gave a dismissive wave. She can use the front steps like everyone else. My blood boiled. She's in a wheelchair. Linda's expression didn't change. Not my problem. You should have submitted the proper paperwork before making modifications to your property. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I had submitted paperwork months ago. I had emails, approvals, everything. But I knew how Linda operated. She probably shredded the documents and pretended they never existed. You've made a big mistake, I said, my voice low and steady. Linda let out a fake laugh. Oh, please, what are you going to do? File a complaint, take it up with the board, we are the board. She turned on her heel and strutted back toward her house, probably thinking she had won. She had no idea what was coming. Ava was out of town for a conference, but the second I called her, she dropped everything. By the time she arrived the next day, she was already on a warpath. She rolled out of the car in her wheelchair, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her expression unreadable, but I could see it in her eyes. She was furious. This is war, she said, adjusting the cuff on her blazer. Linda and her little HOA cronies thought they could push us around. They were about to learn, the hard way, that no one bulldozes a governor's property and gets away with it. Ava wasted no time. The moment she rolled onto my property, she was already making calls. I heard her speaking with state officials, legal counsel, and even a few journalists she had on speed dial. She wasn't just angry, she was strategic. As she spoke, I paced near the remnants of the destroyed ramp, my hands clenched at my sides. The destruction was worse than I'd realized. Not only had the HOA bulldozed the ramp, but they'd also damaged part of the front porch in the process. Splintered wood and torn-up concrete littered the area where the ramp had once stood. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was vandalism. A black SUV pulled up a few minutes later, and out stepped Ava's chief of staff, Jordan Pierce. He was a tall, no-nonsense man in his 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit. He adjusted his tie as he surveyed the damage, his lips pressing into a thin line. Ava finished her call and wheeled herself closer to Jordan. Without missing a beat, she got straight to business. They bulldozed it without notice, she said. We had approval on record. I want every legal angle explored. Jordan nodded, already taking notes on his tablet. Trespassing, destruction of property, violation of federal disability laws, that's just the start. His gaze flickered to me. Do you have security footage? I pulled out my phone and opened the app connected to my doorbell camera. I had already reviewed the footage earlier, but now, with Ava and Jordan watching, I played it again. The video showed a construction crew arriving early in the morning. They had a bulldozer, hired specifically for the job. Linda was there, clipboard in hand, directing them like some kind of dictator overseeing a demolition. She didn't look uncertain or hesitant, she looked pleased. Ava's jaw tightened as she watched. They didn't just remove it, they destroyed it. Jordan's fingers flew across his tablet. I'll draft a formal complaint to the Attorney General's office. We can escalate this immediately. Ava nodded. Good, but I want to handle this on multiple fronts. She turned to me. Do you still have the approval emails? I pulled up my inbox and scrolled to find them. Within seconds, I had forwarded everything to Jordan. He scanned the emails and gave a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. They approved the ramp months ago, he said, and yet Linda acted like you never submitted anything. Classic HOA power trip. Ava's eyes burned with determination. Let's see how she handles the consequences. She turned her wheelchair and headed straight for Linda's house. I hurried to follow, my adrenaline spiking. This was about to get ugly. Linda was outside, watering her perfectly manicured lawn like nothing had happened. Her expression barely changed when she saw Ava approaching. Ava didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You violated the Americans with Disabilities Act," she said coolly. "That's a federal crime." Linda set down the hose and crossed her arms. "This is an HOA matter. You don't dictate policy here." Ava's gaze was razor sharp. "You trespassed on private property and destroyed an essential accessibility structure. That's not just an HOA matter, it's a legal matter." Linda scoffed. "We had every right. The ramp was an eyesore." Ava's expression didn't waver. "You're about to find out how wrong you are." Jordan stepped forward. "The governor's office is filing formal complaints with both state and federal agencies. Expect legal consequences." For the first time, Linda hesitated. "You're bluffing." Jordan didn't blink. "We have video evidence, documented approvals, and witness testimonies. You'll be lucky if this only results in fines." Linda's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "The HOA has lawyers." Ava gave a slow, knowing smile. "So do I. Mine are better." Linda's confidence wavered. She wasn't dealing with a regular homeowner. She could intimidate. She was dealing with a governor who had an entire legal team at her disposal. Jordan continued, his voice calm but firm. "You should also be aware that the media will be covering this. A homeowners association illegally bulldozing a disability-accessible ramp, that's not going to look good." Linda's mouth tightened. "You wouldn't." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Watch me." Without another word, she turned and wheeled away, signaling that the conversation was over. I followed, barely containing my grin. Back at my house, Ava pulled out her phone again. "I'm calling a press conference. If they want to fight, they're getting one." Within hours, news vans started arriving. Reporters set up cameras on my lawn, broadcasting the story statewide. The destruction of the ramp, the HOA's blatant disregard for federal law, it all became headline news. Linda and her board members tried to do damage control, but it was too late. The governor of the state had called them out publicly, and now they were under intense scrutiny. By the next morning, the HOA's lawyer sent a desperate email offering to resolve the issue amicably. Ava's response was simple. "There's no resolution until every person responsible is held accountable." The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear: Linda had underestimated the wrong family. The fallout hit the HOA like a hurricane. The press coverage was relentless, blasting headlines about a rogue homeowners association trampling on disability rights. State officials weighed in, condemning the destruction of the ramp. Legal experts debated the severity of the violations on live television. The public outrage was immediate and deafening. Linda Brewster and her board had gone into full-blown damage control, but it was like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. They issued a weak public statement, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that they would review policies to prevent future incidents. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just corporate-style nonsense meant to minimize the backlash. Ava wasn't having it. She had spent the morning in back-to-back calls with state legislators and disability advocacy groups, ensuring that this wasn't just a news cycle scandal, it was going to lead to real consequences. The HOA had violated multiple state and federal laws, and she intended to see every one of them enforced to the fullest extent. Meanwhile, I had spent the morning reviewing the HOA bylaws and financials. With the public scrutiny now on them, I figured it was a good time to dig deeper, and what I found was a goldmine. The HOA had been misusing funds for years: excessive administrative fees, questionable consulting expenses, even payouts to companies owned by board members' relatives. It was corruption, plain and simple. I compiled everything into a report and handed it to Ava over lunch. She scanned the documents, her expression unreadable at first. Then she let out a quiet, satisfied breath. "This is exactly what I needed," she said. "They wanted a war, we're giving them an audit." That afternoon, a formal complaint was filed with the state's Financial Oversight Board, triggering an immediate investigation into the HOA's finances. At the same time, Ava's legal team hit them with a lawsuit for destruction of private property and violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The HOA board members were personally named as defendants. By evening, Linda was panicking. She showed up at my house, her usual arrogance replaced with barely concealed desperation. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice strained. "We can work something out." Ava, seated on the porch with a cup of coffee, glanced at her with an expression of sheer disinterest. "You bulldozed my ramp," she said. Then you lied about it, then you tried to cover it up. What exactly do you think there is to work out? Linda's composure cracked. Look, I didn't know who you were if I had. Ava cut her off with a sharp laugh. So, if I were just an average resident, you would have gotten away with it. That's your defense. Linda's mouth opened, then shut. She had no answer. I decided to twist the knife. By the way, the state's financial auditors will be here next week. Hope your books are in order. The color drained from Linda's face. She knew exactly what that meant. She took a shaky breath. If we reinstate the ramp and issue an apology, will you drop this? Ava set her coffee down, leaned forward slightly, and fixed Linda with a stare that could melt steel. No, she said, you don't get to dismantle people's lives, stomp on their rights, and then walk away with a simple apology. Every violation, every misdeed, every dollar you've misused, it's all coming back to haunt you, and you deserve every bit of it. Linda looked like she wanted to argue, but she knew it was pointless. She had lost completely. She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The next morning, the state's attorney general announced a full investigation into the HOA's practices. By noon, 2 board members had resigned. By evening, Linda herself stepped down as president, citing personal matters. But it didn't stop there. The lawsuit proceeded. The fines stacked up. The HOA was forced to pay for a new ramp, one that met every possible standard, under the direct supervision of disability advocates. And most satisfying of all, the entire HOA was dissolved within months due to financial mismanagement and legal violations. The residents took back control of their neighborhood, electing a new board that actually worked for the community instead of against it. Ava and I stood on the porch one evening, watching as workers finished installing the new ramp. It was sturdier, safer, and most importantly untouchable by any future HOA nonsense. She took a sip of her coffee, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Well, she said, that was fun. I chuckled, remind me never to get on your bad side. She glanced at me, you'd never be that stupid. I grinned, true. The HOA had thought they could bulldoze over us literally and figuratively. They learned the hard way that some people can't be bullied, some people fight back. And when they do, they win. With the HOA dismantled and Linda out of power, the neighborhood finally started to breathe again. The oppressive rules, the arbitrary fines, the constant nitpicking, it all faded like a bad dream. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now stepping forward, sharing their own horror stories about how the board had harassed them over the years. It turned out that the ramp incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Ava, always one to follow through, made sure their complaints were heard. She arranged a town hall meeting at the local community center, inviting residents to share their experiences. The place was packed. People stood along the walls when all the seats were filled, eager for the chance to finally unburden themselves. One elderly man, Mr. Holloway, recounted how Linda had fined him for having unauthorized plants in his garden, despite the fact that he had lived there for over 30 years, long before the HOA even existed. Another woman, Sarah, described how she had been threatened with foreclosure over minor late fees that mysteriously kept increasing, no matter how much she paid. The more stories people shared, the clearer it became. The HOA had been running a racket for years, exploiting homeowners for profit while masquerading as a legitimate governing body. Jordan took notes throughout the meeting, his expression darkening with each testimony. He had already been working with investigators, but this meeting gave them even more ammunition. The financial audit had uncovered discrepancies, but now they had first-hand accounts of residents being extorted, harassed, and manipulated. Ava remained composed, listening intently, nodding in understanding, but I knew her well enough to recognize the fire in her eyes. The next day, legal notices were sent out to former board members, informing them of the official investigations into their actions. The resignations had not been enough. They were going to be held accountable. Meanwhile, I focused on something else, restoring trust in the neighborhood. With the HOA gone, the community needed to rebuild, not just physically but socially. A few of us organized a weekend cleanup and repair event. People volunteered to repaint fences, fix up neglected yards, and even help elderly residents with home repairs that the HOA had previously obstructed with their ridiculous rules. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now working side by side, laughing, chatting, and forming real connections. The sense of unity was something I hadn't felt since I first moved here. Ava, though busy with legal matters, still found time to check in. She rolled up one afternoon as we were fixing a broken swing set in the neighborhood park. Kids ran around, excited to finally have a space they could use without fear of some board member slapping their parents with a violation notice. She observed for a moment before turning to me. "This neighborhood has potential," she said. "Without the HOA stifling it, it can actually thrive." I nodded, wiping sweat from my forehead. Yeah, it's like people forgot what it was like to actually enjoy living here. Jordan arrived shortly after, holding a folder thick with documents. He gestured for Ava to follow him to a quieter spot, and I trailed behind, curious. "We have enough to pursue legal action against multiple board members," Jordan said. "Fraud, misallocation of funds, even a potential case for extortion. It's worse than we thought." Ava flipped through the documents, her jaw tightening. "I want every charge pursued to the fullest extent, no leniency." Jordan nodded, already in motion, "But there's something else you should see." He pulled out a separate file and handed it to her. I leaned in to get a look. Inside were records of property seizures homes that the HOA had foreclosed on under suspicious circumstances. My stomach twisted. They stole homes. Jordan exhaled sharply. Essentially, yes, they would slap homeowners with excessive fines, manipulate records to show unpaid dues, and then push for foreclosure. In some cases, they even resold the properties at a profit. Ava's grip on the folder tightened. This isn't just HOA corruption, this is organized theft. The implications were staggering. Families had lost their homes because of the board's greed. People had been financially ruined, all under the guise of community management. Ava wasted no time. She made calls, bringing in state investigators and even federal agencies. What had started as a fight over a wheelchair ramp had now uncovered a criminal enterprise. Within weeks, multiple former board members were arrested. Linda, of course, was one of them. When the news broke, she was caught on camera trying to avoid reporters as she was escorted out of her home in handcuffs. Gone was her smug confidence, replaced by sheer panic. The community celebrated. People gathered at the park, talking excitedly about the downfall of the corrupt board. Some even brought food and drinks, turning it into an impromptu block party. Ava and I watched from the sidelines, sipping lemonade as we took it all in. "You didn't just win," I told her. "You changed everything." She gave a small, satisfied nod. They thought they could bulldoze over people's rights. They learned otherwise. The neighborhood was finally free, and more importantly, people had reclaimed not just their homes but their voices. For the first time in years, it felt like a place worth living in again. With the corrupt HOA board dismantled and legal actions in full swing, the neighborhood had transformed. The suffocating grip of the association was gone, and in its place, a sense of freedom settled over the residents. Without Linda's oppressive leadership, people finally felt like they could breathe. But Ava wasn't done yet. She had spent years in politics, understanding how systems could be manipulated and abused. What had happened with our HOA wasn't just an isolated case, it was a symptom of a larger problem. Across the state, HOAs had been operating unchecked, enforcing arbitrary rules, exploiting loopholes, and in some cases, outright stealing homes from unsuspecting residents. She wasn't going to let it continue. One evening, as we sat on my newly rebuilt porch, she laid out her next plan. The state legislature was about to enter its next session, and Ava intended to introduce a bill that would restructure how HOAs operated. Her proposal would require stricter financial oversight, prevent HOAs from foreclosing on homes without due process, and ensure accessibility accommodations couldn't be overridden by petty board members. She had already secured support from key legislators, but she knew the real battle would be against the HOA lobbyists. These organizations had deep pockets and powerful allies, and they thrived on maintaining the status quo. I listened as she detailed her strategy, her voice steady and measured. She wasn't just reacting to what had happened to my home, she was thinking 10 steps ahead, planning a way to ensure no one else suffered the same injustice. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ava called in favors, met with advocacy groups, and gathered testimonies from homeowners across the state. The media had already been covering our HOA's downfall, and now they were following this next chapter, highlighting stories of families who had lost their homes, veterans who had been harassed over minor infractions, and elderly residents who had been trapped under crushing fines. At the same time, the former HOA board members faced a reckoning of their own. Linda, in particular, was in deep trouble. As investigators dug deeper into the financial records, they uncovered more than just mismanagement, they found outright fraud. Money that was supposed to go to neighborhood maintenance had been funneled into private accounts. Bogus fines had been issued to justify foreclosures, allowing board members to profit from seized properties. When the charges were formally announced, the neighborhood erupted in a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Linda and two other former board members were arrested on charges ranging from embezzlement to fraud. The remaining board members, terrified of further scrutiny, fled the area entirely. But even with them gone, the work wasn't finished. Ava's bill was gaining traction, but the pushback was fierce. Lobbyists flooded the state capitol, desperately trying to kill the legislation before it could reach the floor. They argued that HOAs were essential for maintaining property values, that stricter oversight would create unnecessary bureaucracy. Ava wasn't swayed. She called for a public hearing, inviting homeowners from across the state to testify. The turnout was overwhelming. People traveled for hours just to share their stories of wrongful foreclosures, of harassment, of families being pushed out of their homes over trivial violations. I sat in the gallery, watching as Ava methodically dismantled the opposition. She used facts, figures, and most importantly, real human stories. The lobbyists spoke in rehearsed sound bites, but Ava spoke with conviction, and the legislators listened. The vote was close, but in the end, the bill passed. New laws were put in place, ensuring that HOAs could no longer operate as unchecked dictatorships. Residents would have more power, more transparency, and more protection. When the news broke, the neighborhood celebrated again. But this time, it wasn't just our community, it was people across the state. Ava had turned one act of blatant cruelty into a movement. One evening, as we sat outside, watching the sunset over the newly revitalized neighborhood, she finally allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had done what she came to do, and she had won. The HOA had thought they could bulldoze over people's rights. They had learned otherwise. With the new laws in place and the corrupt HOA dismantled, the neighborhood entered a new era. The suffocating fear that had lingered under Linda's rule had finally lifted, and people walked their streets with a newfound sense of ownership. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the residents, not to a board of power-hungry bureaucrats. But Ava, as always, wasn't content with just fixing one neighborhood. She had spent years in politics, and she understood how power worked. She knew that for every corrupt HOA exposed, there were a dozen more operating in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting homeowners. And so she turned her attention to the bigger picture. One evening, as I was repainting the porch railing, Ava rolled onto the driveway, deep in conversation with Jordan. He carried a thick binder under one arm, flipping through pages as he spoke. "The response has been overwhelming," Jordan said. "We've had hundreds of complaints filed against HOAs across the state since the legislation passed. Some of these cases are just as bad as ours: illegal fines, fraudulent foreclosures, even physical intimidation." Ava tapped her fingers against the armrest of her wheelchair, considering how many of these cases could qualify for criminal charges. Jordan handed her a document. At least 50 involve clear financial crimes. If we apply pressure, some of these HOA leaders could find themselves facing serious prison time. I leaned against the porch railing, listening. "So what's the next move?" Ava glanced up, her expression sharp. "We don't just go after them one by one. We make this a statewide initiative, a task force dedicated to HOA corruption." Jordan nodded. "That would require legislative approval, but after everything that's happened, you have the political capital to push it through." Ava set the binder on her lap, flipping through pages of testimony from homeowners who had suffered under HOA tyranny. "We're going to make an example out of them. Every corrupt board, every fraudulent fine, every stolen home, it's all going to be exposed." And that was exactly what she did. In the weeks that followed, Ava coordinated with state officials to create a dedicated task force aimed at investigating and prosecuting HOA corruption. Lawyers, auditors, and law enforcement officers were assigned to review complaints, gather evidence, and bring charges where necessary. The media followed every step of the process, hungry for updates. Homeowners across the state began coming forward with their own horror stories, many of them eerily similar to what had happened in our neighborhood. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators uncovered a network of HOA board members who had been systematically working together to seize properties and resell them for profit. It wasn't just a handful of bad actors, it was an organized scheme spanning multiple communities. With this new development, Ava pushed for a full-scale crackdown. Arrests were made, bank accounts were frozen, entire HOA boards were dismantled overnight. And then the final blow came. Ava had been working behind the scenes to introduce another bill, one that would fundamentally change how HOAs operated across the entire state. It would strip them of their ability to impose excessive fines, prevent them from foreclosing on homes without state oversight, and require regular audits to ensure financial transparency. The opposition fought tooth and nail to stop it. HOA lobbying groups poured money into attack ads, trying to sway public opinion. They claimed AVA was destroying communities and undermining property values. But it didn't work. The people were on AVA's side. Homeowners flooded town halls, demanding change. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak out now stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to let these organizations continue their abuses. And when the vote finally came, it wasn't even close. The bill passed. HOAs across the state were stripped of their unchecked power. The abusive financial schemes were dismantled. And for the first time in decades, homeowners finally had real protections against the very organizations that had once controlled their lives. The victory was absolute. On the night of the final vote, Ava and I sat on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in years. She exhaled slowly, resting her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. It's done. I nodded. You didn't just win, you changed everything. She glanced at me, a rare softness in her expression. We did. For the first time in a long time, the fight was over. HOAs would never be able to wield unchecked power again. And the people, the homeowners, the families, the communities had finally taken back what was rightfully theirs.